Hello everyone, this is Wes Henson, pastor of the Ridge Church. And the Ridge Church campus is located at 7350 Old Highway 13 in Carbondale, Illinois. And I want to thank you for joining me today for this week's small group Bible study for the week of February the 12th, 2023 at the Ridge Church. We're in the midst of this 6-week study on how to discern the voice of God. This is session 3, and in today's study, we talk about character, God's character. Each week of our study, we ask a question that will help us discern the voice of God from all the chatter that surrounds us. We ask the question, and the answer helps us hear God's voice. The first question that we asked was, does it agree with the Bible? And the voice of God never contradicts the Bible. Then we ask the question, does it bring conviction? And the answer to that question is that the voice of God seeks to convict us of the truth. Last week's question was, does it call you to trust God? Discerning and obeying God's voice calls for faith, trust in God. And this week our attention turns to God's character. And the question we ask is, this voice that you hear, is it God's voice or not? The question to ask is, does it align with God's character? If you click on the link, you'll discover a printed summary of this week's study, and then I invite you to join me on campus this Sunday morning at 9 a.m. or online Tuesday night at 6:30 p.m. on Facebook or our website as we go into detail. Okay, let's get started with this week's on-the-go study. So how would you respond if your friend claimed that God told him, he heard the voice of God, God told him that he did not have to forgive someone who had offended him? Could that have been God's voice? Could that be God speaking? Well, we know that God is a holy and loving God. And as a result, God will never say or do anything that is unholy or unloving, and he would never call us to do something unholy or unloving. And God is a God of forgiveness. That's part of his character. And so he would never call upon us not to forgive. The point of our lesson this week is that God never calls us to do something that's outside of his character. And so as we get into our passage for today, which is found in Exodus chapter 34, let me set, if you would, a little background for our study. So we find here that God had already delivered his people from captivity in Egypt, and he was leading them to the promised land. And at this moment, in chapter 34, they are at Mount Sinai, and God had revealed his covenant expectations for the people, including the 10 Commandments. God wanted to have a relationship with the people, and God said, this is the agreement. I will be your God, and you will be my people. And this is how I will be your God, and this is how you will be my people. So Moses went up on the mountain, Mount Sinai, to be with God, to receive God's covenant, if you would. And while he was on the mountain with God, the Hebrews, the Israelites below, rebelled against God. Aaron made a golden calf for them to worship. So as Moses comes down from the mountain, he looks around and he sees all that's going on, and he sees their idolatry, and he is very angry with the people. He is so angry that he takes the 10 Commandments carved in stone, and he throws them down, and he breaks them. And not only does he break the commandments that they're written on, symbolically, he's also breaking the covenant, the agreement, the contract that the people had made with God. And so at this time, verse 30 in chapter 34, Moses is appealing to God to forgive them and to restore his covenant, his agreement with them. Now, Exodus chapter 34 is one of the most encouraging and inspiring passages in all of the Old Testament. You see, the Israelites had forsaken God. They had turned their back on the Lord. The Lord had delivered them from slavery. He had delivered them from Egypt. They had no hope, and God gave them hope. And then they no sooner leave Egypt, then they turn their backs on the Lord. And these events that we see here in chapters 32 through 34 in the book of Exodus lead us to see an act of gracious mercy by the hand of God, because God re-enters a covenant relationship with his people. Okay, let's take a look. Exodus chapter 34, let's begin in verse 1 as we read through verse 5. The Lord said to Moses, cut 2 stone tablets like the first ones, and I will write on them the words that were on the first tablets which you broke. Be prepared by morning. Come up Mount Sinai in the morning and stand before me on the mountaintop. No one may go up with you. In fact, no one should be seen anywhere on the mountain. Even the flocks and the herds are not to graze in front of that mountain. So Moses cut 2 stone tablets like the first ones. He got up early in the morning, taking the 2 stone tablets in his hands, and he climbed Mount Sinai just as the Lord commanded him. Then the Lord came down in a cloud, stood with him there, and proclaimed his name, the Lord. So the truth here is that God is holy, and he establishes a covenant relationship with his children. God renewed the covenant that his people had just broken in chapter 32. And as we read these verses, we are reminded once again that God is forever faithful. Not because we are faithful, not because we are deserving, not because we are gracious, but because God is faithful. God originally provided the stone tablets, but this time he instructs Moses to cut them. And then God tells Moses to ascend up the mountain in the morning, as it would take time and effort to climb to the top. The Lord goes on to say that no one is allowed to go with Moses. None of the animals are to be even grazing on the mountainside. And the Israelites were to treat the entire mountain as holy when God met with Moses on it. Now I want you to catch these truths from verses 1 through 5. God's instructions for us for how to live in obedience to him are clear. God gave clear instructions to Moses. Cut the tablets. Come up in the morning. Don't bring anyone with you. No animals grazing on the side of the mountain. And Moses followed those instructions. Secondly, true biblical obedience should be done with urgency. I mean, Moses went first thing in the morning. And then truth number 3, God keeps his promises. God always keeps his promises. All right, let's look at verses 6 and 7. The Lord passed in front of him and proclaimed, the Lord is a compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger and abounding in faithful love and truth, maintaining faithful love to 1,000 generations. I mean, God is faithful to 1,000 generations, forgiving iniquity, rebellion, and sin. But he will not leave the guilty unpunished, bringing consequences of the father's iniquity on the children and grandchildren to the 3rd and 4th generation. Notice here that God's grace and love is faithful to 1,000 generations. But then God, because of his holiness and justness, has to judge iniquity. But he only does it to the 3rd and 4th generation. So you have this balance. For 1,000 generations, the Lord is eager to show love. And he shows his punishment to only 3 or 4 generations. So you can see here very clearly in the Old Testament where God leans, right? He is faithful to love for 1,000 generations. And the truth here is that God's character is perfect and unchanging. For us to recognize God's voice when he speaks, we need to know what God's character is like. Moses needed to know the character of God. And he might have expected, as we often do, that God would disclose his character as being holy, but one who judges sin and punishes sinners. but instead we see the character of God as God reveals it to Moses and to us. God speaks out of a heart that was, as he says about himself, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in faithful love and truth, extravagant, lavish in his forgiveness, and being both loving and just. All right, let's look on to verses 8 and 9. Moses immediately knelt low on the ground and worshipped. And then he said, "My Lord, if I have indeed found favor with you, my Lord, please go with us, even though this is a stiff-necked people. Forgive our iniquity and our sin, and accept us as your own possession." Truth here is, our response to God's holy character is repentance and worship. Throughout the Bible, we read that the proper response to God's character is worship. Moses' response when he encountered God in this passage was to worship him. The only proper response to an encounter with God is worship. True biblical worship always includes obedience. And Jesus is the true. Here we see Moses being the intercessor between the people and God. And we know that Jesus is the true and final intercessor for us. Okay, that's our lesson for this week. But before we go, we want to make some application. We know that God never calls us to do something that is outside of his character. So how are we going to live out that truth this week? Let me share a couple of ways that we can apply today's lesson. Number one is worship. Reflect on the character of God as noted in this passage, his kindness and graciousness, his faithfulness, and respond to God with a prayer of praise, thanking God for each one of his attributes. Go back and reread this passage again. Thanking the Lord for each one of his attributes and for how you have experienced them in your life. Application number two is evaluate. Consider some of the message. Now listen to this. Consider some of the messages that you've heard from religious leaders who claim to speak for God. Evaluate how their message contrasts with the character of God seen in this passage. And then the third application is obey. Is there something specific that God is wanting you to do in serving him or wanting you to do in the life of another person? Consider how that task reflects the character of God. Obey God and let the loving, gracious character of the one you serve, let that be seen in you. Okay, let's wrap up our lesson for this week. God is holy, God is loving, and as a result, God will never say or do anything that is unholy or unloving. He would never call us to do something unholy or unloving. He always speaks in ways that are consistent with his character, and he makes no exceptions. Okay, if you click on the links, you'll find a summary of this week's Bible study, and then join us on campus Sunday morning at 9 a.m. or online Tuesday night at 6:30 on Facebook or our website as we go into detail. Bye for now.